it has been our thought that the word historical society sort of doesn't fully represent who we are. It suggests a group of people who gather in a very comfortable and I imagine elegantly furnished room behind closed doors and share nostalgic stories about the past and decide that those are their favorite stories, and that's not who we are. And it's not what Jacksonville needs. This is a complicated place with a complicated past. Some of its past stories are magic, and some of them are painfully tragic. But all of them are part of what makes this a great, complicated, interesting city, a place that I feel really lucky to live in, and a place in which I have what I think is the best job in town, because I get to learn so much about this place's past, meet so many interesting people like you all who are history-minded citizens, and so I'm grateful to have a chance to share all that with you. This organization, founded in 1929 by over 200 charter members in the lobby of the Hotel Carling, and continues to be a diverse and engaging community of history-minded folks. So we do these events every year, and we do it in observance of National Historic Preservation Month. That's the month of May. So it's a good inflection point, a good sort of cultural marker to introduce our list of Jacksonville's most endangered buildings. And it's particularly satisfying to do it here in this building that used to be badly endangered. This church, Old St. Andrews, was consecrated by the Episcopal Diocese of Florida in 1888. And it served its congregation until the 1950s, when the diocese deconsecrated it and moved to a new St. Andrew's Episcopal Church over in the Arlington neighborhood. This church was declared surplus, it was put up for sale, it sat on the block, didn't sell, as old churches tend not to sell because they're difficult to adapt to a new use. And by the early 1990s, when the Jacksonville Jaguars NFL franchise was awarded to Jacksonville and to Mr. and Mrs. Wayne and Dolores Barr Weaver, this building had windows that were broken out, doors that were hanging ajar from one hinge. A fire had been started in the church. If you look under the welcome table, you don't have to pick up the tablecloth right now. Just take my word for it. There's new wood in that section of the floor under the welcome table where the floor had to be resurfaced and repaired with new oak tongue and groove flooring because homeless people had started a encampment with a fire in here. The roof was leaking. It was a candidate for demolition, and look at it now. This is a building with a tremendous amount of stories, as churches in particular tend to be. This is a place, like churches everywhere, where people come regularly. They form the closest and most meaningful relationships of their lives. They commemorate the most important occasions in their lives. They bring their worries, their troubles, their sorrows, their fears, and sometimes their greatest joys. And all of that takes place in the walls of a building like this. And for us now to be able to use this and be as stewards and custodians in conjunction with the city of Jacksonville is a great privilege, and it's particularly faithful to our mission, and particularly on the occasion of a list of endangered buildings. This is a great example of a success story and a great example of a successful partnership to rescue a building that might otherwise no longer stand. We owe a lot to the leadership of the city of Jacksonville, and in particular to Mrs. Weaver, who at the time that she and her husband came to Jacksonville, saw this church, recognized its potential, and said, we got to save this. And so she inspired the project to rescue it. I want to thank the members of the Jacksonville Historical Society and History Center's Historic Sites Committee. That committee chaired by Bill Bishop. Bill, would you stand, please? And also the committee served by Amy Palmer, seated at the table here just to my right. Amy, if you hold up your hand, be recognized. Dave Chauncey, I believe you're in the audience. Former board chair of the Jacksonville History Center, Dave Chauncey, and he is seated next to yet another former board chair, Fred Kent. Wave so that he can be recognized, please. And let's see, am I missing anybody else from the Historic Sites Committee? A couple of people. And oh, Dr. Wayne Wood, he doesn't count because he's our historian at large, so he pretty much has his oar in just about every ocean that we row in around here. But Dr. Wood is, for those who don't know him, and that can't be very many people left in Jacksonville who don't know Wayne Wood, but just in case you're among them, he is the author of the most influential, really, head and shoulders above anything else, a book on Jacksonville's architectural heritage, a book published by the Jacksonville History Center, but a book that really inspires and sets an example, and a very difficult to imitate example of how a city ought to catalog and memorialize and document its historic architecture. Dr. Wood is also, in addition to his medical background, he is an honorary member of the American Institute of Architects and a longtime leader in Jacksonville civic affairs, the founder of Riverside Avondale Preservation, and probably the most enduring voice in advocacy for historic preservation. And so I sort of take it for granted that he will be a part of our Historic Sites Committee every year, but we're lucky to have him, and thanks, Wayne, for being here with us. Who else have I overlooked? Our city's new director of planning and development is with us. We're honored to have Brent James. Mr. James, would you stand so people can get a look at this is the guy who will claim some of the credit and all of the blame for everything that you dislike about what's going on in planning and development in Jacksonville. But he comes to us newly appointed to his position and comes from California, and he tells me that he is particularly preservation minded, and so we're grateful to him for deciding to come to the city, and boy, we need him. So thanks, Mr. James. The staff and volunteers of the History Center make this possible, and so do the members and donors and corporate partners and foundations and philanthropies that support our work. If you are a member of the History Center, we appreciate your support and your engagement. If you are not yet a member, that condition can be remedied today with the membership information available at the welcome table at the front or through our website. So without further ado, the historic sites that are on our list, we have handouts. You see the information in the individual the sites. I don't need to discuss each individual site in detail, but I want to say a couple of things about historic preservation, and this is in the context of why we do this. We advocate for historic preservation because it's faithful to our mission, which is to strengthen citizenship through public history education. The more you know about the place where you live, the better the citizen you're likely to be. The more you are likely to care about its future. So historic knowledge is not just about looking backward into the past. It's about being mindful of your stewardship of that place in the present, this place, Jacksonville in our case. And that translates into being a steward of this place for the future. Historic buildings and sites give us a chance to better tell, remember and tell and share the stories of the people and the events that came before us. That's what makes up the legacy of Jacksonville in the contemporary moment. And that all by itself is a compelling reason, I think, for us to continue to do what we do in advocating for preservation. But Jacksonville is a city that some say has had less regard for its history than perhaps its peer cities in Florida and in the American Southeast. And that is sadly evident in a list of the buildings, the historically significant and interesting buildings that we have lost over the years, and that is a regrettable catalog. Having those artifacts of the past matters in helping cement and illustrate the unique identity of a place. Every city is different, no two are exactly alike. But one of the things that makes people recognize the place that they live as distinct, and that makes visitors want to come to a place that's unique, is its preservation mindedness. And two of the greatest examples of that I can point to are just up the coast from Jacksonville and Savannah and Charleston. Those are cities that have really invested in, capitalized, and consciously worked intentionally and with significant public investment and support, right, to reinforce and preserve the historic structures. And those are some of the things that make those downtowns and those communities so vibrant and so economically successful. We can still do that in Jacksonville, even though we have lost some buildings, but when you consider that buildings become eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places once they reach 50 years old, we have a continually new inventory of prospective historic buildings tumbling out, do we not? And let's be mindful of that. It doesn't have to be a century-old building to qualify as historic. There are other characteristics and facts and features that relate to that. We'll see some of that here today. So those are the things that matter about historic preservation. It is not just about clinging to the built environment of the past. It's about strengthening the economic and cultural sustainability of a place in the present. Historic preservation translates into enhanced property values and enhanced community engagement everywhere. And if you don't believe that, here in Jacksonville, just take a look at the Riverside Avondale neighborhood just immediately southwest of downtown Jacksonville, the neighborhood whose historic preservation has been curated by Riverside Avondale Preservation, already mentioned. Today, very different from where it stood 40 years ago. Wayne Wood lived in that neighborhood in the 1970s, and it was the threat to its preservation and the threat to its coherence as a community that inspired him to found Riverside Avondale Preservation. Some of the houses that people live in and take pride in today and the commercial properties in that area were candidates for demolition in the 1970s. Today, it is the setting for some of the highest property values, both residential and commercial, in any zip code in Duval County, and also the site of some of the highest per capita and household incomes anywhere in Duval County. That pride, that identity, that coherence could not have happened without the preservation impulse that's been reinforced by RAP. So all of that speaks to the economic development argument in favor of historic preservation. When we think about endangered buildings, the one that is probably, the three that have probably been most in the news in recent months is what's commonly known as the Laura Trio. That appears at the lower left of this image here. The Laura Trio has been a difficult challenge. It is in private ownership. It has been in and out of different iterations of ownership over the past roughly 20 some odd years. It is an example of buildings that grew out of the aftermath of the most influential event in Jacksonville's history, Jacksonville's Great Fire of 1901. I mention that, and I often say that it's the most influential event in the city's history, not because of the damage that it did. It was fabulously destructive, just like the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871. Yes, it was a devastating event, but it's what happened after the fire that really makes it influential. The fire devastated the landscape of this city, which consisted at that time of almost all of what's now just downtown Jacksonville. And it created a blank canvas. It created an environment into which young, innovative, smart, ambitious architects, engineers, developers, and investors wanted to come and help create a new Jacksonville. And they did. In the roughly 15 to 20 years after the Great Fire, you saw the skyline of an entirely new Jacksonville emerge from the ashes of the Great Fire. And these buildings are emblematic. The buildings at the lower left are emblematic of that emerging new skyline. They were testimony in their time to Jacksonville's renaissance after that devastating and destructive event in May of 1901. having deteriorated to the point where they have been candidates for demolition. They've been boarded up and graffitied and just sort of an embarrassment to the neighborhood and to the city. The opportunity now exists for the preservation community, for the property owner and the city to help create a new Laura trio that will be a symbol of Jacksonville's downtown renaissance in the 21st century. And it's not my place to make the argument for Jacksonville's downtown. There are plenty of people who already advocate for that. Suffice it to say that I agree with those who say that a place without a downtown really is kind of hard to identify as a place, is it not? And a city that has a downtown with buildings of historic significance that have been adapted to use in the 21st century too. This has been an extraordinarily difficult project, as I mentioned a moment ago, because the capital costs are fabulous. The distinctive design of these buildings as they were originally built make them very, very challenging, physically challenging to adapt to a contemporary use in the 21st century. Just look at the narrow floor plates of the building at the left that fronts on Laura Street. You'd never build a building again like that today if you had to design it from scratch. But does that mean that we're prepared to knock it down and replace it with something else? So incorporating a difficult building like that into a redevelopment plan has been one of the particular challenges for this project. The developer has repeatedly asked the Downtown Investment Authority and through them the City Council for extraordinary financial support for this project. And the scope of his requests has really exceeded the discretion that the Downtown Investment Authority has to be able to support the project. As a result, his request has had to go directly to the City Council with no particular guidance from the DIA because it crosses the boundaries of what the ordinance allows them to do. The requests have consistently run into obstacles that have to do with the Florida statute, and that has sent this entire deal back to the negotiating table over and over again. I'm encouraged to be able to report to you that a viable proposal for redevelopment, a viable financial and capitalization package has now been surfaced by the developer, and meetings between the development team and the Downtown Investment Authority have been surprisingly fruitful and encouraging, and at this point we expect a development proposal to be on the DIA's governing board agenda for its regular meeting in June. I'm encouraged by what I've heard. We have been encouraged before, so I'm not taking this to the bank necessarily yet, but you wouldn't be an advocate for historic preservation unless you had a hopeful spirit, would you? So let's all be hopeful and encouraged by the prospects for this. The Snyder Memorial Church, appearing in the upper right, has been another example of a perpetual and stubborn redevelopment project. And being a church, it's uniquely challenging because of the way it's built. I went through the building from top to bottom a number of years ago and considered it as a possible site for the establishment of a new Jacksonville History Center. Its physical challenges are imposing. It has sloping floors. It has walls that were built out of massive amounts of brick and masonry that are impossible to move or very difficult to move. And that yields floor plates and floor divisions that are very awkward to work with. To remodel a building like that really calls for such broad changes that it threatens to really kind of subvert its original identity, besides being close to unattainable in terms of finances. You know, nothing's impossible in the way of historic renovations. As an old attorney friend of mine used to wisecrack about historic preservations, all it takes is money, right? And so if you can come up with enough capital to be able to underwrite the expenses, then you can do what you want to do. But when banks lend money to private property owners, guess what they want everyone? They want their money back plus interest. And when public finance is called into play to support projects like this, a compelling and convincing case needs to be made to elected officials and through them to the voters to be able to justify that investment. So we continue to look for a solution for the Snyder. I'm grateful that the city has invested in at least sustaining it. A new roof was put on within the past few years, but the building really awaits an innovative and smart and resourceful new use. The other hot topic in historic preservation conversation lately has been the schools that are owned by the Duval County Public School System and the discourse in the media and the conversation at school board meetings and in other public venues lately has been boisterous. Schools are more than any other kind of building like churches in that they are artifacts of their community. They are well known to the people who live in their orbit and who become members and worship at churches. They are the places where every one of us who had any kind of conventional childhood upbringing shared some of the most formative experiences of our lives. Is there anybody who doesn't remember the elementary school that they attended and the teachers that they experienced there and the friendships that they made with kids that they went to school with? And the same applies to junior high schools and senior high schools. Those are buildings that touch us in our, as I said, in our most formative years. And for that reason, they also touch the neighborhoods and the communities that surround them. So there is a psychic investment in preserving old schools that really sort of exceeds that of almost any other kind of building that you might like to consider. They also share something else with churches, and that is the difficulty of redeveloping them and converting them to an economically sustainable use in the 21st century. Schools in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and into the 1950s were built according to a very different set of conditions than those that exist now in the 21st century. They were built typically without air conditioning. They had very large windows that were meant to open to let in natural light and also for ventilation. They were built before there was any notion of telecommunications or any kind of engineering for smart building technologies. They were built at a time in neighborhoods when they drew a population of students who typically could walk to the school and didn't require a school bus loop or a vehicle pickup loop for parents who were snagging their children at high speed on the way to the next engagement. You see what some of the physical issues are. Add to that very robust construction, typically, that is also very difficult to move walls around and to adapt to a successful 21st century use. I'm illustrating some of the schools that have been identified as possible candidates for repurposing or disposal by the Duval County School Board. And I have then occasionally, and again fairly recently, in conversation with members of the school board who are wrestling with a perpetual challenge. I mean, it's always been difficult for a school board like Duval County's to figure out what to do with a school that is encountering and approaching its physical obsolescence. I mean, there's no other business, no other enterprise, is there, in which it would be so difficult a decision to dispense with a piece of real estate that was no longer economically functional to serve your mission. But that's the challenge that the school board faces. Not only does it have the challenges, the physical challenges that I mentioned about its site and its construction, but schools that have been improved over the decades with grants from the state of Florida or from the Federal Department of Education now have capital investments that have strings attached to them. And so there are limits on what the school board can do to either sell off or reconfigure or change a school. There are lots of sort of organizational and institutional limitations on a school board's freedom to act, on top of the fact that there are passionate constituencies, groups of citizens and neighborhood groups that really care about what the school board's decision is going to be. In the 21st century here in Duval County, if you've been paying any attention to the news about public schools, the additional complication is that enrollment and census in public schools has been declining. That means that schools and school administrators and the school board, having always been faced with tough decisions about these schools, now really have sort of a virtual gun at their backs. What do you do to continue to sustain a functional school district in the face of declining economic metrics when obsolete buildings are demanding attention or demanding repurposing? And just in case that's not complicated enough for the school board, they're going through another superintendent search right now. So not an easy time to be a school board member, if ever there was one. So I'm sympathetic to the challenges that the school board faces in trying to address these issues. Our role at the Jacksonville History Center, and our role, I'm including all of you in this conversation, is and should be to be helpful, thoughtful about sustainable new uses for schools that have to be repurposed and decommissioned and adapted to new uses. There are examples of that. And the school district here in Duval County has indeed disposed of some old, underperforming, dysfunctional or limited function, obsolete schools that have been repurposed for a variety of uses, including most commonly a community center. In some cases, they have been adapted for a different kind of educational venue that's no longer a public school. And probably the most high-profile example, which I'll show you before we conclude the presentation today, is the conversion of the old John Gorey Middle School, junior high school in the Riverside area into what's now called the John Gorey Apartments. It is a upscale residential condominium development in which the envelope of the building and much of its interior have been preserved and faithful to the original. But nevertheless, what used to be a set of classrooms have been converted into really good quality residential apartments that have been sold off into private ownership as condominiums. It's a beautiful example of adaptive reuse of a historic school. And all it took to make that happen was money, and plenty of it. That project would not have been possible without the passion and financial support, again, of the same benefactor who helped save Old St. Andrew's Church, Dolores Barr Wheeler. She took that on as a personal mission, a project that she helped support, and Riverside's neighborhood, the area around the Gorey, are very fortunate that she took that on. But again, it's an example of a project that really takes a tremendous amount of upfront commitment of capital and risk of capital. The surprises that meet a historic preservation developer in undertaking a project like that are indeed so hard to catalog that one of my friends who has made significant investments in historic preservation simply says, there are no welcome surprises in historic preservation. That was Jack Meeks. Bill Bishop, who works in this area, knows this as well, if not better than anyone else. Have you ever come across a happy surprise in a historic renovation project?
Come across an interesting surprise.
Interesting surprise. I mean, I suppose finding Spanish silver coins under the floorboards of a building, that might be a welcome surprise.
Some things we didn't know existed. Usually they're not.
Yeah, and those surprises generally come with budget challenges, right? So it takes deep pockets and a contented feeling that you will be satisfied by a successful outcome. Whether it's a profitable outcome or not is another question. That brings us back to the subject of religious structures, churches, and we keep our eye on a number of these churches in urban settings have become particularly challenging for preservationists. They have all the characteristics that I already mentioned. When they're still in the hands, in the ownership and management and stewardship of their congregations and their denominations, they face financial challenges that really stem from a couple of things. Number one, the buildings were built at a time when churches were elaborate structures, and they were supported passionately by congregations who raised considerable amounts of money to spend and get a beautiful edifice. They wanted a church that would have beautiful windows and architecture that helped celebrate their commitment to the Spirit, right? And these are the things that we look for in houses of worship. These are the things that you see in historic churches. And historic churches over the decades have generally been prone to declining membership. Traditional membership has left churches, as this congregation did in the 1950s, and left for congregations and new settings in the suburbs, if they maintain a church relationship at all. But church membership and Sunday worship in most of all denominations across the United States has been in steady decline in recent years. All of these things mean that the financial challenges of supporting old churches has become increasingly fragile and increasingly difficult. There, it's our mandate to call attention to them, which we do through this list, and to help be mindful of things that historic church congregations and owners can do to help make them sustainable. In terms of residential settings, of course, these are a couple of perennials. The Drew Mansion in the Springfield neighborhood, the duplexes over on the west side of town, west side of downtown, the post-Civil War cottage in the Brooklyn neighborhood, and a perpetual on our list, Wesley Manor, which strictly speaking is not in the city of Jacksonville. It's just across the boundaries of Jacksonville and St. Johns County on the south side of Julington Creek. We count it because so many of the people who live there really count themselves as Jacksonvillians. I think most of us probably know at least somebody who does or has lived at Westminster Woods. And also because its architect was one of Jacksonville's most notable practitioners of the mid-century modern style. I'm referring to the late Robert Broward, an influential architect whose reputation and work appears all over Jacksonville. These buildings, as I say, continue to appear on our list, and we're alert to ways that we can be helpful and supportive of preservation efforts there. A new addition to the list this year is the Scottish Rite Masonic Temple, just north of our location, just on the other side of Logan's Creek. This building, built in 1926, coming up on its centennial, and an extraordinary facility, an extraordinary standing testament to a community organization, the Scottish Rite Group. And they built it specifically for their purposes in the 1920s, and they continue to own it and operate it as their temple and in the place that houses their meetings and their administrative offices in the present day. I had the good fortune to be invited to tour that building late last year, and I was troubled to see that it has been the victim of an accumulating amount of deferred maintenance, and I say that with great admiration for the efforts of the order that is preserving it, that has been maintaining it, but they face a similar amount of similar challenges as church congregations, declining membership, and a changing sort of set of investments and expectations in the facility, and a building that was built to incredibly robust and complicated standards when it was originally constructed. But that means that working on that building and keeping it up at 100 years or so of age is extremely complicated. Just finding the craftsmen and the workers who are skilled enough to be able to work on things like walls, windows, roofs, and infrastructure, that's a challenge in the 21st century. We don't build buildings like this anymore, and that means that we do not have a community of artisans and skilled workers who know how to work on buildings like this in the 21st century. We tend to build things that are modular and efficient and expedient and quick to build, right, in the 21st century. And the skilled workers that can execute a complicated renovation or just preservation project are far and few between. And that means they command an extra wage. And that means that these projects really become even more complicated to execute. And I'll just share one other thing. A peculiarity of the Scottish Rite Temple is that having been built for an all-male organization and still in the service of an all-male organization was built with no ladies' rooms. And so thinking of an adaptive reuse in the 21st century has an additional bit of a complication. It's customary to find an old building for which it's difficult to adapt because you can't very easily accommodate ADA restrooms. We're all accustomed to seeing that, right, with renovation projects. This is the first time I've run across a building that simply had no ladies' rooms. So that was a bit of a curveball. These two projects under the same ownership have been underway for some time. The old Independent Life Building and its companion property across the street, the Ambassador Hotel, mixed-use developments that have run into apparently some obstacles of late. The delays, we hope, will not be fatal to the project, so there's already been a significant capital investment. And some notable Jacksonville citizens have cared enough about these to put their own money at risk in supporting them, but still the project continues to be difficult. The Earth and M.M. White Youth Recreational Center up on the northwest side of town off Moncrief Road and the Claude Nolan Cadillac Building have very little in common between them, but they are both significant artifacts of a unique period in Jacksonville's past. The Claude Nolan Building is recently changed hands and is in private ownership, and we're hoping that a sustainable new development proposal will emerge there. The former Universal Marion Building is an example of the mid-century modern architectural style. Dr. Wood, please refresh my memory. Who was the architect for the Universal Marion?
There was a couple of shopping center architects from New York, and if you hadn't asked me, I thought I would tell you about them. They weren't Jacksonville architects, but they were nationally known, and the highlight of that building, of course, was the rotating restaurant on the top, the Emperor's. It's now no longer rotating. And the wonderful honeycomb design on the outside. It was somebody in sharp with the architects.
The building has been used as the headquarters and administrative center for the Jacksonville JEA, formerly known as the Jacksonville Electric Authority. And that public utility recently built a new headquarters building for themselves just on the other side of the downtown core, right across from the Duval County Courthouse. It's a beautiful new facility and apparently more efficient for their uses and also more appropriately engineered for some of the smart building solutions that the JEA governing board and administration was looking for. So that leaves us with this imposing edifice almost right in the core of downtown. It's part of the identity of Jacksonville's modern skyline. And it is a tremendous example of the mid-century modern style in architecture and construction. And that style has become something that increasingly is emblematic of Jacksonville because this city grew so robustly in the 1950s and the 1960s, around the time that the JEA building was constructed. And so that style, having now reached 50 some odd plus years of age, is increasingly contributing more buildings like the Universal Marion Building into their age of eligibility for National Register designation and local landmarking consideration. We will point to another example of that in just a moment, but The mid-century modern architecture style is a symbol of increasing historicity in certain locations in downtown and the Arlington area, as we'll get to in just a moment. And for that reason, it is an opportunity, but a challenging one. This building has been mentioned as a possible destination for the University of Florida's proposed new campus in Jacksonville. Whether or not it'll turn out to be functional for that is a question open to some discussion and debate. But if not that, then what? Then what is the question that faces us, that faces JDA, that faces the city at some point, which will have to be comment involved, no doubt, and weigh in on some of the prospective solutions. The Jack's Brewing Company, an example of Jacksonville's manufacturing and industrial past. This is a perennial on our list and continues to be a challenge for adaptive reuse. Thank you, Kate. The Armory, another perpetual challenge in Jennifer's Hall. Jennifer's Hall in the La Villa neighborhood, a particularly interesting and challenging building. It is at the heart of what was a culturally rich and diverse historic neighborhood. It used to be an incorporated city in its own right until it was annexed into the city of Jacksonville. The building renovated, or a renovation project begun with the support of a major grant, I understand, through the state, and the legal entanglements associated with that grant now continue to impede redevelopment alternatives for it in the present. And the Duval County Armory, that's a classic example of a building that has challenging construction issues that make its adaptive reuse fabulously complicated for anybody who would undertake a new solution. An arts group has several times proposed investment in making it a center for arts and culture. It also faces those challenges from the flood-prone nature of the topography and where it sits adjacent to Hogan's Creek. I don't think I have fought as hard for any historic preservation cause and lost as this one. The old Ford Motor Company plant in the Talleyrand industrial area on the east side of downtown Jacksonville, just about 10 blocks from where we are, over my shoulder, on the river immediately next to the Matthews Bridge. This building was an opportunity for us to share so many cool stories about Jacksonville's industrial past and about its seaport history and about all the workers in the community of industrial employees who made their livings and supported their families out of work here. It's a great way to tell the story of Jacksonville's role as a car city, a place where Ford Motor Company products were assembled. It's a great way to tell the story of Ford itself. There were so many things that we could use this as the basis for interpretation for, and this is a striking and architecturally distinctive building designed by one of the most famous industrial architects in the United States and perhaps internationally. Other examples of historic Ford Motor Company plants have been preserved and successfully adapted to really very imposing and great culturally and economically contributing uses in the 21st century. Probably the best example is in Richmond, California, on San Francisco Bay, just about 20 miles north of San Francisco. That has been adapted into technology space and public use space, and it was roughly a $100 million project when it was completed, but the building recently sold for a greater amount than that, which is just more proof, if any were needed, that historic preservation projects really can be economic contributors and can be economically sustainable. Yes, it's a heavy financial lift. Yes, it takes a passion. Yes, it takes time to execute on these. But with patience and capital, these things really can be successful and lead to great outcomes. We recently lost these historic residences in the Mandarin community south of here, lost them to the impulse for new residential development in those sections. Probably, I don't know if I'd call it the crown jewel, but it's one of the crown jewels of successful historic renovations is what used to be the Hayden Burns Library downtown. Now a building that houses a constellation of Jacksonville's nonprofits operating under the name of the Jesse Ball DuPont Center. This was another classic example of the mid-century modern impulse in design and architecture rendered obsolete by growth and replaced in the early 2000s with the new Jacksonville Main Public Library right across the street now from James Weldon Johnson Park and catty corner from the Snyder Memorial Church. The new downtown Jacksonville Main Public Library is perhaps the crown jewel of the Better Jacksonville plan that was approved by voters in the early 2000s. And this project would not have existed, could not exist, could not have been renovated without a tremendous capital investment on the part of the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund. The former CEO of the fund, Sherry McGill, was probably the animating force behind this. She convinced her board to support the project. Nevertheless, they still had to borrow money to execute on the project. It was enormously expensive. I believe the budget exceeded $25 million, and that was in 2007 dollars, by the way. I don't know what that would translate into the present. But what economically sustainable use could have been proposed that would have supported that kind of capital investment? I can't think of it, but nevertheless, this project has spread its impulse, spread its effect throughout the neighborhoods around it. And by the way, it's an example of how a historic building sometimes is converted to an alternative use that really bears little relationship to its original purpose, but we accept that and encourage that in the interest of sustainable long-term preservation. The Elena Flats, another example of resident, in this case residential adaptation of what had been transient lodging facilities, a boarding house in its original iteration, and converted and modernized into beautiful modern apartments thanks to a significant capital investment from private investors, in this case Jack Meeks and Joanne Tredenik. And Bill Bishop's firm, again, was the architect involved in that renovation. And I suppose you would probably not disagree, a project that presented lots of complications and surprises along the way. Am I wrong?
No.
In a word. The challenges of those buildings should not be a deterrent to our ambitions for successive renovations, but nevertheless, they're a bit of a cautionary tale. Two more successes, of course, what's now the Calvin Chop House, adapted into modern use, having been a bank, now one of Jacksonville's premier upscale restaurants, and the project, the result of a loving and really substantial capital investment by its owner, Jacques Clement. And the John Gorey Junior High School, I've already discussed. Now a successful and beautiful residential condominium, thanks to the animating force and the generous capital support of Dolores Barr Weaver. Sweet Pete's across from City Hall, the Barnett Bank Building. The Barnett Bank Building, an example of converting an office building into residences, and a successful result of the project that was launched by the developer who is now currently facing so many challenges with the Laura Trio project. The old Brewster Hospital, a building that was converted from residence into Jacksonville's first hospital exclusively for African Americans, and now the headquarters of the North Florida Land Trust, renovated entirely at the expense of the city of Jacksonville in a project that started out being a $300,000 renovation, then a $500,000 renovation, then $750,000, and I think the eventual concluding budget was somewhere well north of $1 million for that project. but a tremendous artifact of Jacksonville's past. And projects that are encouraging signs of continuing appetite for renovation. The Death Store in the historic East Side neighborhood, just a few blocks north of us here, just off of Florida Avenue, and also the Philip Randolph Boulevard, used to be a landmark business in the historic East Side community, and now undergoing renovation with the generous support of Bliss and Lift Jacksonville and the historic East Side Community Development Corporation. And the Fire Station Museum, owned by the city of Jacksonville, relocated twice, once off of its original site at Catherine Street, now back to its original site, or close to its original site at Catherine Street, just off Bay Street, and awaiting disposition, we think, for continued use as a fire station museum, but the nonprofit group that used to administer it has relinquished control, and so we're looking for evidence of where that project is likely to go. I just conclude anticipating a question, and I'll take questions, happy to answer questions and comments and discussion, but something else that's been in the news that touches on the subject of historic preservation is the recent sale of the Five Points Theater building in the Riverside neighborhood called Five Points, just south of the approach to the Fuller Warren Bridge. That historic building, a 1927 office and movie theater building, now approaching its centennial, was in a state of deterioration when it was purchased and renovated by a local investor, H.W. Mike Shadd, who restored it to its original exterior appearance and restored the interior and restored it to functionality. It has become a local historic landmark and a tremendous asset to the Five Points neighborhood. It recently has changed hands, Mr. Shadd and his family deciding that they were ready to move on, and the new owners have indicated they do not intend to renew the lease of the existing movie theater, a small neighborhood movie theater that has operated off and on in the building for most of its existence. This has caused quite some energetic advocacy on the part of residents who lament the closing and potential disappearance of the old movie theater. And here I think that we can, certainly understand the reluctance to see the disappearance of something that has been a cultural artifact to the neighborhood and to so many people over the years. On the other hand, the building does have local landmark status, and so it's not going anywhere. It's not a candidate for demolition, not a candidate for any significant external changes. The new ownership group with whom I have had conversations have satisfied me that they are credible, history-minded investors, and what they see here in the Five Points neighborhood is the upside for investment in a neighborhood that really identifies itself with its architectural past and its heritage. That's the kind of investor that we want to encourage, I believe, and that we would like to see succeed with their project. They have been able to do what they do, for the most part, with private capital dollars. I would love it if an investment group like that were in a position to execute on some of our more ambitious projects like the Laura Trio, but we take the victories that we can and build from there. So with that, I'll say thanks for being an attentive and patient audience, and happy to either allow for some discussion or take any questions that I can.